In Capernaum, not far from the Sea of Galilee, there was a woman. She was a lonely woman. She was a sick woman. She felt bent by the pain that she felt within her body. She shouldered it as well as she could, but still, she felt left out of the world. Because in those days, if your bleeding went on for more than 7 days, you were considered unclean. And hers went on for 12 years. During that 12 years, it meant that she could have no relationship with her husband. It meant she could have no relationship with her children, because just to touch them would make them unclean. Then they would have to go make sacrifices. They would have to go wash in the running, living waters. And she didn't want that for them. So, in her own little apartment, they put curtains on the doorways so that she could talk to them through the curtains, so that she could have some kind of communication with the outside world. And some days, when she felt well enough to get up, she would go early. She would wrap her head and her body, and she would go early to the walls of the temple, and she would pray. She would pray hard that someday, that a healer would come along that wouldn't just take her money and tell her there was absolutely nothing they could do for her, that she should just go home and prepare to die. She had hope that every day that she got up and she could take a breath into her lungs, that there was hope that one day a healer would come along. So this morning, she felt good. And she got up early and she went to the walls of the temple and she prayed. There was no one around, and she bore her soul to God and said, please, please send me a healer. Help me find someone who will help me. And as she walked home that day, she saw the sky, a beautiful color of blue cerulean. She heard birds in the sky. She smelled the sweet smell of jasmine wafting through the airs. And she said, maybe today is a good day. Maybe today something new will happen. And she hurried back and she went into her apartment and closed the curtains. Later that day, as she was staring out from her balcony and watching people go by, as she did many times, she heard a rustle on the other side of the curtain. And as was one of the things she liked to do, she had a stool sitting right next to that curtain. And she sat there and she listened as the servants started talking about this master healer that they had heard about, this man who could heal the blind, who could raise people from the dead, who could send out the demons from people's bodies. She sat there and her heart began to fill with a feeling of hope. And she thought to herself, if I come close enough to touch, close enough to feel, I could be healed if I come close enough. And that one thought kept her going for the whole day. And she listened as they talked about this man named Jesus, and she thought, one day he will come through our town, and when he does, I will be there. And she went on, and days went by, and months went by, and one day she heard this clamor outside of the window, and she ran to the window and she looked out, and this throng of people started walking through the streets. And as they were coming through the streets, they were just all full of joy. And across behind the curtain, her servants were going, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. And her heart began to swell. She said, this is my day. I know I can do this. And she wrapped her head and her body so people wouldn't see her, because most of the time when they saw her, they would run to the other side of the street because they did not want to become unclean. And so she went out the door and she tried to be as gentle and quiet as she could, but there were so many people. They would push her this way and that, and sometimes they jabbed her with their elbows in that tender spot in her body, and she curled in pain. But she continued on because she knew this was her day. And if she could just get close enough to touch, close enough to feel, she could be healed. If she could come close enough. And she moved forward, people all around her. And one time she got knocked to the ground, and they stepped on her and they kicked her, and still she moved forward as much as she could, inching toward where this big collection of people was. She managed to stand up, and she said, close enough to touch, close enough to feel. I could be healed if I get close enough. And this time she pushed herself. She said, excuse me, pardon me, let me through. And all of a sudden, a spot opened right in front of her. And there he stood. She saw the back of his head. She said, this is my moment. And she reached forward and she leaned a little bit, kind of just jumping almost, and she fell to the ground. And as she did, her hand touched the hem of his cloak. And when that happened, she felt power rush through her body. And all of a sudden, her skin was no longer pale. Blood returned to her face. The stench of the blood no longer was with her. And she felt wonderful. And Jesus said, I just felt the power leave from me. Somebody touched me. And Peter said, Lord, look at all these people. How could you not be touched? He said, no. There was someone. And he looked, and she could hide no more. And she rose up and she walked towards Jesus. And she fell to her feet. And she said, Lord, I'm so sorry, but I know that thou hast healed me from the power that you have. He reached down and took her hand. And of course, everyone thinking she was unclean would have made him unclean. And he took her and he raised her up. And he looked into her eyes and he said, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace now. And she stood a little taller. And she felt wonderful. And she turned around and started to walk towards her home. And she said, I came close enough to touch. He said that I was healed. Now I am healed because I came close enough. And at that moment, she saw her husband, and he noticed that there was a glow surrounding her, and the two of them ran to each other, and they embraced, something she had longed for 12 long years. And in that momentary embrace, and the tears streaming down her face, she knew that it had nothing to do with her actually touching his gown, but it was the action, her faith, that had made her whole, because she had come close enough to touch.